So you mentioned this in your sermon on Sunday, in verses 44 through 46 or 45 of Acts chapter 2. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. They began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all as anyone might have need. And that's so important as it relates to your point in the sermon, which was how we are called to be a community that is generous, that is giving. And you brought up the subject of what is facing our country right now, which is this growth of fascination and lots of people buying into what socialism is selling. And what is described in this passage, first and foremost, is also not some sort of group of Christians living in a commune with all things in equality. That's not what's being described, as you mentioned, and it's also not socialism or even any variation of socialism like democratic socialism, as you mentioned on Sunday. And one of the reasons that you brought up, which was so helpful, is that throughout the scriptures and in the New Testament, we see this understructure that is assumed and presupposed that there is private ownership of property. And as it relates to being a generous and giving community, God has ordained that so that we might give volitionally, voluntarily. That is, as you said, it's a free will giving. And I thought that was so helpful. Looking at other passages in the New Testament that really amplify this, talk a little bit about the verses we see in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 that bring this issue to the level of the church, and how as a church we are called to handle this, to respond to this, and to deal with this. Because what seems to be the case often with people that buy into the ideologies of socialism is this very subtle, but it's an understructure of really laziness and selfishness and wanting to take what is not earned, wanting to take, and there is this tendency toward not working. And this seems to be very attractive to my generation, particularly. So can you talk a little bit about how the church responds to that? How do we shepherd people through that?
Right. We act like that laziness is not a sin. It's not a temptation. That it's not a reality that we would fight personally, just as much as we fight greed or lust or anger or anxiety or anything. It's a sin. It's a sin.
Right.
And so it's a sin against God's design and against God's goodness. And one of the designs of God, one of the good ways that God has wired even the world in common grace, is the law of sowing and reaping.
Absolutely.
Right? So you reap what you sow. And so there is reward for work. And not in a salvific way, not in a way that we work our way to heaven, right? Of course not. But God has given the clear commands to work. Even the Sabbath command for Old Testament Israel. There was this command to work 6 days and then on the seventh rest. And let's not miss that command to rest follows a command to work. You can't rest if you're not working. And so there's inherent in all of that is this command to work and the fruit of that work. And the fruit of that work is this entrusting us with the means to give, the means to provide for those who are own. And that 1 Timothy 5, somebody who doesn't provide for their own is worse than an unbeliever. They are worse than an unbeliever. Get that. They do not evidence the fruit of life, of the Spirit of God. Not evidence of life, a believer. They're worse than an unbeliever. In the sense that even in common grace, most unbelievers would provide for their own. So that's just sickening. It's just disgusting. It's so defaming of God's name as a loving, caring Heavenly Father. And so that's how serious this is. And so it is just an assault on that to say, we should just, all get all the same thing by entrusting the government of all people, of all systems, that, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Why? Because of the fall of man, because of sin in man. And so in that sinfulness, there's this reality that we can't trust that they're going to distribute everything equitably. That's not going to happen. That's a lie. And so the reality is there's sowing and reaping, and there's a call to work. And Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 3, like you said, if somebody doesn't work, they shouldn't eat. And so we must all respond to that, to work. And how that functions in the church, he says, don't associate with somebody who's not going to work, but I command you to work. You should be like Paul. He worked, he provided for himself. And then he says, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not even eat. And he goes on to say, if anyone, 2 Thessalonians 3:14, if anyone does not obey what we say in this letter about working, take note of that person and have nothing to do with him, that he may be ashamed. Do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother. That's step 3 of church discipline. That's step 3 of church discipline. To be warning him, and Paul calling him out in a public letter and to the church, and that step 3 to the church, saying, call that one out. And call him out as a brother, call him out in love. Let's say it is so serious that you not act like an unbeliever, worse than an unbeliever, who would not even work to provide for your own. And so that's how serious this is. And an idea of the government ownership of everything, as opposed to private ownership, just steals that work ethic, and it steals the responsibility and freedom of giving out of that. Because Ephesians 4 would say, don't steal. What stops you from stealing? Work so that you will have means to provide and give to those in need. So how do you give? You work, provide for your own, and then you joyfully, freely give. And so generosity is an outflow of faithfulness in those commands. And so we live that out in those ways. And just, by the way, along those lines, as we think about giving, I think about we've worked and we've given to the government in our taxes, and they're now giving this stimulus bill back to each of us. And I would just encourage everybody, think about, what are you going to do with that? Pray about, what does the Lord want you to do with that? And there's a sense, I wonder, in the Acts 2 reality, that some sold their possessions to take care of those who were in need. That we know of a handful of people already who've lost their job, been furloughed, or their hours been cut way back, and they may be in need. And particularly in a month from now, they may be in need. And maybe you're getting a big check or a small check or whatever, and you've still got the same job, you still got the same income. Do you need that? How much of it do you need? And pray about what God would have you to do. And certainly I don't want to coerce anybody to do anything against their own will, and the Lord will take care of that. But I just think it's an interesting opportunity to say, wow, why am I getting this, and what does the Lord want me to do with it? And maybe he wants me to just give it to the Lord, give it to the church to see what are the needs that are out there. And so we know some already, and so we're addressing and trying to help some of those already. And so in order to do that, there's people who sell things and give, and there's people who say, hey, I have a need, I've lost my job, or we have needs in these ways that are real needs. We're working and we're trying to be faithful, but we have these real needs, and so make those known. And so again, any reciprocal command, there's a giving and a receiving of it. Just as much as we need to receive and give comfort, counsel, encouragement, prayer, there's a reality of that in even physical needs, financial needs. And so this is a case where that could be exercised, and God could move and get glory. God could get glory. And that's what we want. We want God glorified.